I'm Jason Tmerek. The focal length of a lens is the distance between the optical center of the lens and the camera's imaging sensor. Well, changing the focal length of a lens affects the field of view, the depth in the shot, the depth of field, and the perception of time. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use the focal length as both a technical and creative tool. There are two categories of lenses: zoom lenses, which let you change the focal length, and prime lenses, which have a fixed focal length. Well, zoom lenses tend to be a lot more convenient and flexible by letting you quickly zoom in or out to frame your subject on set, but at the cost of sharpness and the amount of light they let pass through to the imaging sensor. In order to change the focal length, zoom lenses require additional lens elements to bend the light, and the more glass the light has to pass through, the more it's refracted. So that way, by the time the light reaches the imaging sensor, it is not as bright or as sharp as it was when it entered the lens. Now, you may not notice this on lower resolution cameras, but you will certainly notice it when you're shooting higher resolutions, such as 2K and higher, especially if you watch this footage back on a large TV or on a movie theater screen. Prime lenses, on the other hand, don't have as many optical elements because they have a fixed focal length, so they allow more light to pass through to the imaging sensor. Now, although the sharpness is generally better with prime lenses, you'll have to physically change the lens every time you want to change the focal length. Well, the four most common focal lengths for prime lenses include 24mm, 35mm, 50mm, and 85mm. And with these four lenses, you could easily shoot an entire feature film. Now, if you need to get a wider field of view, you can always get a 20mm lens, a 16mm, 14mm, 12mm, and even 10mm lenses. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you need a narrower field of view, you can always get a 100mm or a 135mm lens, which are the most common. Now, the only drawback is that good quality prime lenses can be pretty expensive. Actually, very expensive. For example, a set of 6 Zeiss Supreme Primes costs around $112,000. If you don't have an extra $100K sitting around, you could always just rent them. Just make sure you have the proper insurance in case something happens to them. Now, if you're budget conscious like I am, I recommend the Rokinon DS Cine Primes, which cost about $2,500 for a set of 6. Yeah, I know, $2,500 is still a lot of money, but it's the cost we pay for higher quality optics. Ultimately, the lenses you choose, whether zoom lenses or prime lenses, are all determined by the project. If you're shooting a documentary and need the flexibility to quickly reframe your shot to capture live events, a zoom lens is ideal. But if you're shooting a production where you're in more control of the environment, say on a movie or TV commercial, prime lenses may be your best bet. Well, regardless of your choice, always get the best quality lens you can afford, because you'll definitely notice the difference in the final product. The focal length of a lens is the distance from the optical center of the lens to the camera's imaging sensor when the lens is set to infinity, and we measure this in millimeters. So when you talk about a 25mm lens or an 85mm lens, we're actually referring to the focal length of that lens. Now, the focal length affects how your image looks on screen, with the most noticeable being the field of view. The shorter the focal length, the wider the field of view. As we lengthen the focal length, the field of view narrows, bringing the subject closer to us. We measure the field of view in degrees across the horizontal axis. So an ultra-wide-angle 16mm fisheye lens will have a field of view of about 180 degrees. Now, a telephoto lens with a long focal length of 500mm will have a much narrower field of view of only about 5 degrees. So I'd like to show you how, by changing the focal length, we can change the field of view of your shot and how that can be helpful. All right, so right now I have a 14mm lens on the camera, which is a very short focal length, also known as a wide-angle lens. And you can see we're getting a lot of depth in our tiny studio here. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and swap it out to a 24mm lens, and you can see how the field of view gets a little narrower. Now this is the field of view from a 35mm lens. All right, now here is a 50mm lens. Now I'm actually exposing at a t1.5, so my aperture is wide open. And you notice we're starting to get a nice shallow depth of field in the background, and because we're shooting with a longer focal length, it's starting to compress the depth in the shot. All right, so this is our field of view from an 85mm lens, much tighter field of view. Now, an 85mm lens is the longest focal length I have, but you can purchase lenses that go up to 400mm if you want to. Now, one thing you can do is many digital cameras that have a larger imaging sensor allow you to do a digital zoom. So right now I am zoomed all the way out, but if I zoom in using the digital zoom, I can increase my field of view. Just be aware that this is not an optical zoom. You're not actually changing the focal length. Rather, the camera is digitally zooming in on the imaging sensor itself. Now, because this is a 4K imaging sensor and I'm only recording in 1080p, that gives me a digital zoom factor of about 2:1. So we're not getting any degradation in the resolution of the image, but it is giving me a little bit of a closer field of view just in case I need it. Now, changing your focal length doesn't only change your field of view. If I grab a lens, say a 50mm lens, the field of view it creates is constant, and the light passing through it creates a circular image. Now, the camera's imaging sensor is rectangular, so the area of the image generated by the lens must completely cover the sensor, or we're going to see vignetting in the corners of the frame. The camera and lens industry uses a 35mm film frame as the standard. So digital cameras with a full-frame 35mm sensor will capture more of the lens's image circle than cameras with smaller sensors, thereby producing a smaller field of view. Well, we calculate the difference in coverage between a 35mm full-frame sensor and a smaller sensor as the crop factor. For example, the 50mm lens on a full-frame sensor will give us a 46-degree field of view. But if we put the same lens on a camera with a smaller APS-C sensor, which is commonly used in many DSLR cameras, the field of view is only 31 degrees. That's why it's important to know the crop factor of your camera sensor. Now, on my Sony FS5, I know the crop factor is about 1.6. So anytime I throw a full-frame lens on my FS5, I multiply the number of millimeters by the crop factor to see what the comparable field of view would be on a full-frame camera. So a 50mm lens on my camera will create the same field of view as an 80mm lens on a full-frame camera. Now, the only reason this matters is when you see the marketing images for a lens showcasing a beautiful, expansive wide shot, well, you're only going to get that same field of view if you have a full-frame camera. If you buy that lens and put it on a camera with a smaller sensor, just know that your field of view will be much narrower. Now keep in mind, the crop factor is a ratio of the physical size of the imaging sensor to a 35mm full-frame sensor. It has nothing to do with the resolution. So it doesn't matter if your sensor captures 2K, 8K, 4K, whatever. Many cameras may have the same size sensor, but they may also capture different resolutions. For example, both the Red Dragon, which captures 6K resolution, and the Red Helium, which captures a resolution of 8K, have exactly the same sensor size. Now, the Red Monstro, which also captures an 8K resolution, has a much larger sensor size when compared to the sensor of a Red Helium. So remember, the crop factor has nothing to do with an imager's resolution, only the physical size of the sensor. Now, you may be wondering why lens manufacturers don't just make lenses with smaller image circles for smaller sensors. Well, they do. Since many of the DSLR cameras use an APS-C sensor, which has a crop factor of around 1.6 times for Canon cameras and 1.5 times for Nikon, Sony, and Pentax cameras, manufacturers make APS-C lenses. Now, these lenses focus light onto a lens circle that maximizes the coverage of an APS-C sensor. So when you use an APS-C lens on a camera with an APS-C sensor, 50 millimeters is 50 millimeters. You no longer need to adjust for the crop factor. But just be careful, because you cannot use an APS-C lens on a camera with a larger sensor. Otherwise, the circular lens image will not be big enough to cover it, and you'll see vignetting in the corners of your frame. All right, everyone, that's all we have time for today. If you want to see the rest of this video tutorial, if you want to read the exclusive companion guide and download projects that you can use to practice these techniques at home, be sure to check out the full course at filmskills.com. In the all-new Film Skills Camera and Lens Master Course, I've partnered with Hollywood directors and cinematographers to teach you the tools and techniques to achieve a more cinematic look that attracts higher-paying clients. In the first section, you'll learn the roles and responsibilities of the camera crew on set. I'll take you onto Hollywood sets where you'll learn directly from the camera crews behind some of the biggest TV shows and movies on screen. Then I'll methodically teach you how to configure, prep, and build your camera package. Learn how to test and maintain your lenses, how to choose the right camera accessories for the demands of each shoot, and how to avoid costly mistakes in the field. Next, I'll take you deep inside each camera function and teach you how to push your camera's capabilities to the limits to achieve a professional, emotionally compelling cinematic look for each and every shot. You'll learn how to find the sweet spot of your camera's imaging sensor, how to set the perfect ISO, choose and expose the right frame rate, how to set focus using pro techniques no matter how your subject is moving or how shallow your depth of field. Learn how to set proper exposure with your f-stops and t-stops, how to use neutral density filters and polarizers, how to utilize the focal length to control compression and the depth in your shot, how to master your depth of field, how to create action shots with your camera shutter, and how to properly manage media for a seamless transition into the editing room. Then in the next section, learn advanced composition techniques lifted directly from Hollywood sets, from framing for multiple aspect ratios and determining eye lines to determining camera placement in complex setups. You'll learn standard shot types and common variations, secrets to professional composition, and how to frame people, how to determine eye lines and create depth no matter what camera you're using. So whether you're just a beginner or an experienced professional looking to improve your techniques, the Film Skills Camera and Lens Master Course takes you deep inside the filmmaking process, revealing techniques used by professionals on top TV shows and movies. The knowledge and experience in this course is one reason why over 125 top colleges and universities use Film Skills in their classrooms. And finally, when you complete the course, you'll receive a personalized certificate of completion and you'll be listed in our professional certification database. So if you're ready to unlock the true potential of your camera and lens, increase the value of your work, and attract higher paying clients, then join the Film Skills Camera and Lens Master Course today.